Welcome to the Power Panel podcast, a show where we follow the leadership journeys of exceptional African women at the helm of public service and civil society. Our question is, how do African women lead and deploy power? I am your host, Ambassador Rachel Omamo, a senior counsel, diplomat and former cabinet minister in Kenya. Our episode today seeks to explore how leadership is constructed, how it evolves. For some African women, leadership is an extremely serious, thoughtful, and unpretentious endeavor, bereft of high drama and flamboyance. Anchored instead on well-honed skills, strength of character, and trust, carefully built and developed over time. In using their power to effect change, these women lead with courtesy, sometimes even quietly. Importantly, they listen.
Listen. Listen. Trust as well. But to get people to talk to you, because as a researcher as well, and when you're trying to shape policy and when you're trying to weave and trying to narrate a story, you need people to provide you information that you're not going to read or hear anywhere. You're not going to read in the newspapers, that you're not going to hear on the radio. You wanted them to be able to trust you with the highest, most confidential information ever, and to trust that you would safeguard that information so it doesn't backfire onto them.
Dr. Comfort Iro, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group, is a leader of this kind. She is a distinguished and highly respected political analyst and advisor. Her life's work is devoted to conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution throughout our world. Comfort's journey is propelled by enduring curiosity and is influenced by her warm upbringing, which straddled two continents.
I was born in London. I grew up in a very Nigerian household. I spoke my mother's language, which is Yoruba. I mean, I think there's complaints as to why I don't speak Edo, which is my father's, but, mothers have an influence on their children. And I was raised by my mother's side of the family. So that might explain why the Yoruba side of me was predominant. But I am, at the end of the day, a Bini child from Edo State. But yes, I do find that I operate in several worlds as well. There's the birth and the motherland where your parents come from. But also, as a woman of colour, so they all play out in different ways. But because I was brought up as a Nigerian, and my parents made it very clear to all three of us that they wanted us to know our background. Even if we grew up in London, we grew up knowing our cousins through our mother's siblings as well. I was very much influenced and shaped by early childhood when my parents, who met each other here in London in the 60s, did what I think a lot of parents of their generation who are living abroad did, is they wanted to take their children back home. And even if they couldn't take their children back home, make sure that their children were looked after by family back home.
Comfort's early years are buttressed by the warmth of her extended family.
When I was taken to Nigeria at a very young age, and these were formative years, and I, for a long time, believed that my mum's sisters, her siblings, particularly her eldest sister and husband, I grew up believing that that was my parents as well. Coming back to London, I was like, oh, who are these people? I was like, oh, these are your real parents. And my mum's brother as well. So as a term of endearment in Nigeria, we tend to call our elders by the geographic location or area that they come from. So I was raised by my mum's elder sister, who I still to this day call Mummy Campos. Her husband was the registrar at University of Lagos. So I grew up calling them Mummy and Daddy Campos. And then I called my parents Mummy and Daddy London. And then my mum's elder brother, his wife, I would call them Mummy and Daddy Canada, because they were living at Canada, but they came back to Nigeria. And some of my cousins call them, Mummy and Daddy Ibadan, because they lived in Ibadan, which is another major city outside Lagos. But now we've got other labels. So my Mummy Campos is actually Mama Ikeja, because she lives in the government area of Ikeja.
As children mature, they often register subliminal messages which ignite their curiosity and influence their future endeavors. In this, comfort is no exception.
It wasn't until I started studying in secondary school that I realized that I liked learning about the past a lot. And I didn't understand why I had a thirst for history. I had an interest also in the two world wars, World War I and World War II. I was always curious why, and this was in the 80s. And I also was curious in understanding sort of how states relate to one another. And I began to realize that the reason why I was interested in history and also the society of states was largely because I spent a great deal of time listening to conversations between my parents and their friends and their relations, and beginning to understand in the mid-80s why my parents never returned to Nigeria, and also why my mum's sisters particularly were keen for us to come back to London when myself and my older brother were in Nigeria in the 70s.
But why didn't Comfort's parents return to Nigeria?
It's not that they couldn't. I think, and again, I never appreciated this until I started reading sort of letters, exchanges between mother and father, a couple between son-in-law and father-in-law. And it was a time of turbulence in Nigeria. So they both found themselves in London as students and working and married here in London. Nigeria was coming out of colonization, and the early years were as stable as they could be. But then there was a civil war in Nigeria and the fallout from that. And I think, like most parents, when they managed to get their children out to benefit from education from overseas, they also said, you can be a through line, you can sort of be the base, and we can get others to benefit also from education, living overseas. And I recall reading one letter where my dad, I think the plan was that he comes back to Nigeria to be a lecturer. And I think the conversation was such that there's more advantage for you in London for the moment, stay there for the moment, and build up your profile, your career, give your children the opportunity also to be educated, and sort of you be our representative here. I mean, in the end, over time, I think also because of upheaval in Nigeria, there was a decision to stay in London. What brought me back from Nigeria to London was an imminent coup. Would I have gone back? Would I have stayed? It's a good question. I eventually did go back to Nigeria. Work generally brought me back to Nigeria more than anything else.
The civil war that Comfort refers to is the Biafra Civil War that took place in the 1960s in Nigeria.
Well, I learned about the horror, the tragedy, the fallout, just by listening to others' story. Yeah, learning about it as, as a student at university. So I didn't experience war, and my parents would argue that they never saw them. I don't believe that they saw themselves as refugees, but I think they felt that in the end, it was a war that made it difficult for them to return home. Although they did go home, they took us home, they went back for their parents' funerals and other occasions, but not to live at home the way that their siblings did.
At our first signpost, Comfort's early life draws our attention to the beauty of our African families. Indeed, it takes a community of love to raise a child and to create a pipeline of opportunity for succeeding generations. Comfort is bright and academically gifted. Upon completing her master's degree and interested in global security, politics, and conflict, Comfort begins her career as a research associate at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. She then seizes the opportunity to be a research fellow at the Centre of Defence Studies at King's College in London. This latter assignment provides Comfort with a rich perspective on conflict situations in diverse locations across the world.
My period when I was at King's College, I had the experience not just to work on Africa and particularly security sector reform, but I had the opportunity, for example, to lead conflict assessment studies for the then Department for International Development, DFID, through a project that was taking place at King's College. And I went to places like Fiji and Solomon Islands. I got involved in helping to think through stability in Moldova. And, I got involved in analysis, conflict analysis in Nagorno-Karabakh and in the crisis between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And that then was seen as a kind of like a frozen conflict.
Comfort works in a fascinating but complicated field that is often misunderstood. What does political and conflict analysis entail? Are they specific skills that a person needs to succeed in this field?
There are basic skills that you're looking for. One is to have an inquisitive mind, a curious mind, always questioning, asking why certain things are the way they are, trying to understand how things are unfolding. You're trained at university, at least social science, although I started off doing sciences and maths and then switched to social science. So you spend a lot of time always just trying to understand the nature of things, to figure out why certain things are happening, to try to connect certain events together, to understand the connections between peoples, places, and events. You're always questioning, and then you're trying to form a picture, trying to figure things out, and then try to weave a story throughout and trying to get the reader, the observer, or others that you're explaining things to, that you're trying to get them to form an idea of an event, of a situation, of a dilemma. I mean, in crisis group, we may have a policy outcome. We may want to try and weave a pathway out of a crisis. But in the process of doing that, our job is to tell the story from the vantage point of each person, to understand the dilemma of each of the conflict actors, to have a good understanding of the landscape of a crisis, of what is influencing that crisis, both internally within the region and externally. And before you form a conclusion, to actually lay out the land, and then you try to ask the question of what does all this mean? And then is there a way in which we can then figure out a way out of the crisis, or at least try to start to build incrementally a pathway to help resolve a crisis? But there's certain fundamental skills, basic education that any analyst, social science, political analyst should have. Writing is an important one, but never come to a conclusion without sort of exploring why we have a problem. If you've come to your conclusion before, then it may be biased already. And if you're trying to shoehorn your analysis into your conclusion, into your own perspective, then it's likely to be flawed, subjective. I always say to analysts, I should be able to not figure out who you are. So it should be bias free.
Comfort's natural curiosity and intellect seem to blend perfectly with her chosen career. Determined to develop and polish her skills further, in 2001, Comfort joins the International Crisis Group, a leading international organization dedicated to prevention of war and fostering peace. She assumes the role of Project Director, West Africa Office, beginning her long association with this institution. What informs this decision?
The reason why I went to Crisis Group back in 2001 was because I felt that I couldn't give policy advice of the type that I was being asked to do from my perch at King's College without understanding these countries and understanding what these countries are doing. So I needed to be in the field, in the country, in the region. But I wanted to be able to do analysis, and I also wanted to shape policy and also advocate. And Crisis Group made sense.
The Crisis Group enables Comfort expand her comprehension of conflict at a more micro level and to elevate her voice. However, seeking to deepen her field experience in a multilateral setting, Comfort welcomes the opportunity to be part of the UN mission in Liberia as a political officer and advisor to the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General to the mission. Liberia was at this time recovering from a protracted civil war. Comfort provides insights on how state collapse can unfold.
So I should say I arrived in Liberia in 2003 for the UN mission. I had been doing research on Liberia as part of my university thesis. So I never saw Liberia during what most people would call its first civil war, from sort of the 1989-90 right through till 97. And then there was a period of instability, and then conflict resumed again late 90s, 99. And certainly when I was living in Freetown in 2001, you saw again rising insurgency. I saw Liberia's collapse through the civil war in Sierra Leone. And you saw, Liberia from a West Africa perspective, again, this is stories that I heard. One of my cousins, I recall her, and in fact, one of my uncles saying to me that, you would take a car from Nigeria, drive to Ghana or Ivory Coast, have tea, and go dancing in Liberia. Liberia was a center of activity, of culture, of music, of entertainment. It was a place where West Africans went to relax. It was a great peninsula, great fishing place with Sierra Leone. So it was hard for me and my cousin, one of my oldest cousins, went for a honeymoon in Liberia in '89, and I couldn't quite understand that because I was like, wait a minute, the country went into civil war. The crumbling of the edifice of Liberia didn't start in '89. I think it started a lot earlier. But by the time the Civil War broke out, institutions were already framed. There was a very predatory society. Grand theft was taking place. You had sort of a very informal, illicit market. And you also had key infrastructures, key institutions of state, the army itself now sort of fragmenting, the police also fragmenting. There was no revenue to talk about. And you saw, as you saw in a number of other places, the instrumentalization of various identities, ethnic groupings as well. You had that tension between the center, Monrovia, and various peripheries who never benefited in terms of basic services. So it was no surprise that one of the poorest counties of Liberia, Nimba County, is where the war started. It was also not a surprise that because there was a contest then between Charles Taylor giving his own identity and then the southeast of the country also rising up against what they saw as sort of an ethnic conflict as well. So a lot of it was already crumbling on the eve of 18 when the war started.
Observing the effect of war on institutions, households, and people, and working at the UN mission to contribute to the reconstruction of the Liberian state, what leadership skills did Comfort gain?
To be honest with you, some of it was already formed when I was West Africa project director at Crisis Group. And I had no management skills before that, when I took up the position. And I learned a lot then about leadership. And then when I came into the UN, I was one among colleagues who themselves, I had never worked side by side with people who were diplomats or ambassadors in that way before. I was learning a lot from people who, number one, had been in UN missions before. Number two, had come from embassies. Number three, were ambassadors themselves. This was a remarkable moment for me, working with people who were diplomats and diplomacy. And for me, I was a kid in a candy store because suddenly here I was, a research analyst working in a non-for-profit organization who is doing a lot of, research, trying to formulate policy. Yes, I had been in the circle of diplomacy because a lot of thinking and political thinking and trying to come up with policy required us to talk to diplomats. But for the first time in my life, these became my colleagues in a sense. So they were my mentors because I suddenly was in a room with people that I was like, wow, you have been there, you have been at the table bilaterally as government, and you worked at regional institutions, and you are also now at UN officials. They helped nurture, guide my thinking, shape my leadership. It was from them that I sort of began to also nurture and sharpen what I had learned at Crisis Group. I wasn't a leader then. I was around people who had held leadership positions and people who had held quite significant positions in their government or multilateral institutions as well.
The UN mission was evidently a place of self-discovery and experiential training for Comfort. What is the most valuable lesson she learns?
Listen, listen. trust as well. But to get people to talk to you, because as a researcher as well, and when you're trying to shape policy and when you're trying to weave and trying to narrate a story, you need people to provide you information. And you need them to provide you information that you're not going to read or hear anywhere, that you're not going to read in the newspapers, that you're not going to hear on the radio. You wanted them to be able to trust you with the highest, most confidential information ever, and to trust that you would safeguard that information so it doesn't backfire onto them. So listening to people, but also, the UN is a multicultural organization. You are confronted with so many diverse people of different cultures, different backgrounds, different experiences as well. And it's about how you sort of are respectful of that and accommodating of the varied cultures as well. So I was in the political section, for example. In that section alone, there were different people from different colleagues from West Africa. So that was number one. And even though I was from West Africa and from Nigeria, I was working with Francophone West Africa, which I had never had that experience, intimate this experience before. But I was working with other colleagues from other parts of Africa. And then you are confronted with colleagues from Latin America, from East Europe, from Russia, from China. And I was like, oh, wow, it's kind of like it's a melting pot, right? So things can get lost in translation, but things can just become remarkably innovative, exciting, but also remarkably challenging as well, because there are clashes of views and understanding and interpretation. You see, I came to the UN because I wanted to watch the Liberian peace process unfold. I wanted to get the primary information myself. Now, you may ask why I didn't do that with a crisis group, but I also felt that this is a good moment to do it within a multilateral organization. And I'd spent a great deal of time at crisis group trying to figure out what a peace plan could look like and trying to figure out what the UN's role, and then encouragement of other people in the UN saying, well, look, put your money where your mouth is, step in and help us with that. And it was a remarkable experience, one that I'll never forget. Challenging, but remarkable experience.
As we take this short power break, we ask that you subscribe to the Power Panel podcast. Let's work together to expand the Power Panel community. Visit our website, birdsongafrica.com, and follow us on social media to plug into the Power Panel network. Email your thoughts to hello@birdsongafrica.com. When we return, we unveil the next stage of this journey. This is the Power Panel podcast. After spending approximately 3 years at the UN mission in Liberia, Comfort joins the International Center for Transitional Justice. Here, she supplements her comprehension of other aspects of peace and conflict resolution.
The reason why I went to the International Center for Transitional Justice, ICTJ, was because of an experience that I had in Sierra Leone and Liberia. When I was in Sierra Leone, one of the big international initiatives was this idea of a hybrid court, trying to deal with accountability and impunity for the crimes and war crimes that were committed in Sierra Leone. And they created the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And one of the recommendations that Crisis Group had made, both in Sierra Leone and Liberia, was that Charles Taylor, who had been indicted, it was unsealed in 2003, we had recommended that Charles Taylor answer his day in court. And I was very curious about transitional justice and about how you better balance peace with justice. That made me curious about the whole debate about peace versus justice, or peace and justice, but also about how you deal with reparations, or how you deal with accountability writ large. And it didn't have to be prosecutorial only. Celia was having a remarkable process called a Truth Commission. Liberia was going to go through one as well. So I wanted to understand these processes better and how you weave them in a way that doesn't derail efforts to get to a peace process. Hence why I chose to go. And a number of people also encouraged me to say, come to ICTJ. That would be a good learning ground. That was a remarkable experience in its own right, a highly political process, and that it wasn't just legalistic, it wasn't just technical, but very strategic and understand the calculations about how you deploy these various tools. But I felt that having learnt that, Crisis Group was still the home in terms of piecing all these things together.
Interestingly, Comfort returns to the International Crisis Group in 2012 and takes up the senior role of Africa Program Director. Why so?
Yeah, so because Crisis Group encapsulated everything that I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to inquire as to why things were they were within states and between states. I wanted to understand the relationships between states. I wanted to be able to inform policy through my understanding of things that I saw in the various countries or regions of international things that I saw. And I wanted to be able to advocate for things that I believed were important to help end war, to stabilize and to help improve the governance of a number of countries. Now, a number of that was informed by my experience working in Africa, in a number of African countries, but it was also informed by my period when I was at King's College and having experienced all of those things at the UN and International Center for Transitional Justice. I came home because all those experiences still brought me back to Crisis Group. It says Crisis Group was still the home in terms of piecing all these things together.
At this stage in Comfort's career, we discern that leadership pathways can be carefully constructed over time. Comfort builds hers on a bedrock of sharp intellectual skills and a deep knowledge of her craft. She augments this with practical hands-on experience, which she then layers with curiosity and attentiveness about human nature and the dynamics of politics, conflict, peace, and justice. She engages with discretion as an objective, trustworthy professional, seeking realistic solutions to conflict. Arriving at our second signpost in Comfort's story, we note that when you are competent, perceptive, and prepared, leadership finds you. With her multi-layered, rich, and diverse experience, Comfort deservedly rises up the ranks at the Crisis Group, becoming interim vice president in 2021, and then in 2022, making history on her appointment as the first woman of African descent to head this organization.
When you're the first or something, then yes, the expectations are raised. But I should say that although I was an insider, the first insider, and he was sort of an interesting hybrid, was Rob Marley, who was my predecessor. And he came to the organization in 2002 from the Clinton administration and became the program director for our Middle East, North Africa program. And he stayed with us to 2014 when he went back into the Obama administration. And at the end of that, he came back as Crisis Group. So in a sense, he sort of paved the way and enabled the case for an insider like me.
In Comfort's experience, how is a leader who is an insider perceived?
Because you're an insider, lots of assumptions are made that, well, you know the organization and you know all the issues and you know, da, da, da. And even though I'd been a crisis group initially, first time around as project director and then came back as Africa director, there's an assumption that, you know, you understand and therefore you can make those changes. In my experience, actually, no. I have to say that there was a lot of things in the organization that I didn't know, that I didn't appreciate really well. And I spent a great deal of time learning and discovering. And again, you know, Crisis Group, it's global in its reach and it's diverse in its perspective and its people. And also each regional program, from Latin America to the US to Asia, Europe and Central Asia, MENA, Africa, they're all different. I mean, there are sort of similarities here and there, but they're all different and they have different experiences, different issues. You know, I saw Crisis Group through the lens of the Africa program, but suddenly I had to learn and understand what was the dilemma and issues of each program. But there was still this expectation, and it's not a surprising expectation, that because you have an understanding and because you faced some of these dilemmas, that you would have a better understanding. And therefore, it's this leadership that could help sort of wrestle some of those issues. But quite frankly, each leader that's come into the organization from the reset, I came in first with Gareth Evans, each leader's built on his or her predecessor of the structures, very strong structures that the ones before me had put in place as well. So I didn't come in and have to fix and rebuild. I was bequeathed something quite strong, and I intend to do the same thing with my successor, to bequeath him or her with a strong and successful organization.
Comfort takes over the helm of the crisis group at a moment of pronounced uncertainty in our world. We seem to be living in an age of impunity, rage, and disinformation.
The International Crisis Group has published its annual watch list focusing on 10 countries facing serious conflict or increased violence. The president and CEO of Crisis Group drew the world attention to...
How does Comfort keep her team focused and credible in this increasingly untidy world?
It's really, I mean, yeah, untidy is a good way of describing it. Messy. Anybody looking at the world 30 years ago and looking at the world we're in, it's remarkably different. You know, in 1995, there was a sense in which you could use the UN and multilateralism writ large in a very meaningful way to help sort of bring peace and to stabilize the world. You know, there was a flurry of peacekeeping operations. I mean, this was the era also, we shouldn't forget this, the appalling genocide in Rwanda, the end of apartheid in South Africa, the horrors, you know, of the civil war in Somalia. And then you had the breakup of, you know, Yugoslavia and bringing that crisis there to an end with the Dayton Peace Accord. So that was the era in which Crisis Group was born. It was a period of high expectation, you know, where multilateralism would be able to help navigate difficult, choppy waters, where you could maybe craft peace agreements, where peacemaking was seen as credible. I mean, still difficulties, but nonetheless, it was a period in which, you know, the indispensable power of the United States, you know, and the Western confidence. And a lot of those things have been sort of shattered as a result, you know, and I think significant geopolitical tensions, rising powers, you know, Western democracy looking pretty shaky, proliferation of non-armed groups. And it's just a remarkably different world that Crisis Group lives in. But this is the reason why Crisis Group was born, to be able to rise above this turbulence. And I remember what Gareth Evans said to us back in 99 or 2000, and when I met him, your job at Crisis Group is to find the political will, not to say that the political will doesn't exist. Your job is to create the political will. Your job is to be innovative in thinking through, in being creative, into unlocking the blockages that we tend to see in international arena, is to rise above the inertia and is to find a way in which to think through political settlements and compromise.
Has the fluidity and uncertainty in our world altered the work that Comfort leads and undertakes?
That job hasn't changed today. It's harder, complicated, because there's a multiplicity of actors involved in the conflicts who can complicate peacemaking, because the norms against, the use of force are further eroded, and, the laws of war, they're not honored at all. And you've got, as you noted, the COVID, but the economic shocks that have accompanied that, and the anger that is arising in lots of societies, that the world is warming faster, so we've got to deal with climate change. And that itself is triggering mass displacement in certain places in the Horn of Africa, for example, Kenya, the flooding and all those issues. So there's just a proliferation of issues and ramifications and fallout from two major wars that we're watching as we speak. But nonetheless, and I'm speaking to you as Crisis Group is entering sort of its own strategic review and say, look, this is the environment in which we are in, and asking ourselves how we operate in that, environment, acknowledging that much has changed since Crisis Group was born, but also saying that this is how we can meet the moment, and doing that with my colleagues, not in a sort of idealistic way. We have aspirations as an organization. We want to save lives. We want to stop conflicts, but we're not blinkers, and we're not sort of idealist airy-fairy. We really dealing with the reality and being an important voice on the big crises on the day, but also those conflicts that are off the radar, and making sure that we continue to provide that highly valued coverage of crises that are either deprioritized or off the radar as well.
Faced with the complexities of our time, what leadership style does Comfort adopt at the helm of the Crisis Group?
I said to you earlier on that for me, listening was important. That's what makes you a good analyst at Crisis Group, that you listen and that you spend a great deal of time listening to all the various perspectives, and it's hence why our model is global. We're in all the key hotspots. We don't parachute in. We're on the ground. Our analysts are in the story, and they spend a great deal of time capturing the different voices, capturing the different views, and trying to understand the dilemma of the individual, the groups, the countries, and then standing back from that, trying to paint that picture, provide a narrative of that crisis or that issue, and then dispassionately trying to work out what would be the beginnings of a sustainable process to end the war as well. The reason why I appreciate what I do also is that it's highly political, but it's also highly pragmatic. And I don't come I'm not an ideological person. I believe in giving you the space to experiment, to think, and to think big, to think ambitiously, and to think boldly. But also, I appreciate the wisdom and the intellect of people around me, and I want to be seen as a person who allows the space for wisdom and intellect to come through, but also to allow a diversity of ideas. And the reason why that's important to me is that in this world where I think people are really increasingly distrustful of institutions and are also nervous because they don't have the space on the table or see the usual suspects on the table, I try to make sure that the space, that the table is accommodating for everybody.
The essential value of an organization like the Crisis Group is the objectivity of its analysis and opinion. How does the growing trend towards disinformation affect its credibility?
Now, you raise an important point of disinformation. I'm talking to you at a time where Crisis Group is facing real disinformation. My colleagues, they work in the most complicated of spaces. And, whether it's South Caucasus, it's Ethiopia, it's in Venezuela and in Iran, where, our methodology, how we do our work has been open to challenge. Our job is conflict prevention. Our job is to diffuse the temperature. Our job is to find a pathway to peace. And I said we do this in a very delicate way, but we find that those who don't believe in diplomacy and who don't believe that you have to talk to your enemies to charter courts of peace, that is all being challenged by people who don't believe in multilateralism, don't believe in mitigation, don't believe in conflict prevention, don't believe in diplomacy, and will find different ways in which to complicate your efforts to try to resolve conflicts and stay focused on trying to manage that. I think that for me is the biggest challenge that we face going forward as civil society, regardless of crisis group. I think civil society in general.
Are these the issues that Comfort worries about? Is this what keeps her awake at night?
Yes, I think that the idea of civil society, I think the idea of independent thinking, of fair-minded thinking, of trying to listen to everybody's perspective, of not being ideological, not picking sides, but only one of saving. I think that is being challenged, and you see the space for civil society being closed. You see media, journalism also being compromised, where credible journalism that is not taking a particular view, that is doing genuine work, that is telling the truth, that is putting facts on the table, that is verifying, fact-checking, is being squeezed all the time, and making sure that we're able to leave the space to increasingly pair on the ground expertise and trying to make sure that you're telling the truth and providing the truth and verifying facts. That's being tested today in the world that we're living in. And I do think that those who believe in the idea of fact-checking on ground truths, on believing in diplomacy and believing in early warning and conflict prevention, I think they have a responsibility and a duty to make sure that civil society, local, regional, internationally, are protected in an era of high stakes disinformation and misinformation.
Being the president of one of the world's most influential NGOs, does Comfort consider herself to be a powerful woman?
Depends what you mean powerful. I almost rain against what I recognize that I'm in a position of power, or in a position that is perceived as or is viewed as powerful. I recognize I have an opportunity to make a difference, and that I am heading an organization who for the last 30 years, with a very strong normative backbone to our work, that is increasingly able to sort of peer our on the ground expertise with views from influential centers. I recognize that confers upon me a responsibility to be effective, to use that in a way to help shape and do good within the mandate that we have. If that's power, then I take it, because it's an honorable way of defining power, and power can be abused as well. So I see the responsibility and the accountability of the position, especially given the difficulties that we've faced. But I also recognize that how my position is perceived, and therefore people see power in it. I see the power to influence and to shape through the work of my colleagues as well.
If Comfort met a young political analyst today, what would she tell her about power and leadership? What is Comfort's power mantra?
Be yourself and be respectful of others. Because I have watched in different ways how it's very easy to undermine people, but it's very easy to inspire people when they see that you are open to them and accommodating. I'm where I am because other people have opened the doors to me. I can't tell my story of where I am today without acknowledging the role, an important role of people who don't even realize that they open the doors to me. I say to any young person, be mindful of who you are and stay faithful to who you are, but always respect the other person in front, because you don't know their story. You have no idea who that person is as well.
As we conclude, we note that Comfort affirms that the route to leadership is not a thing of caprice, but rather requires deliberate preparation and profound compassion for other people, especially those in danger. When women lead with respect and sensitivity and focus on finding solutions to seemingly intractable problems, not only do we fortify others, but we also create the possibilities for peace and understanding in our world. In this, Comfort's leadership and commitments offers a model to be emulated. We thank Dr. Comfort Iro for sharing her story with us. We also thank you most sincerely for listening and look forward to your company on our next episode. This is the Power Panel Podcast.